It's Monday night.
I've been in the game a long time. When a catcher catches the ball and it's strike three, you call the guy out. It's that simple, isn't it?
And if it's Monday, it's the knee jerks.
I'm not going to sit here and rip umpires. But you saw what you saw, clearly saw what you saw. I just saw it for the 10th time. Write it and say something once in a while. Have the nerve to say something.
Detroit sports talk with attitude.
Attitude on three. 1, 2, 3. Attitude.
Coming up tonight, will Big Al guess whose birthday it is? Who are the jerks of the week? What will Eno rant about now? The answers coming up next. Two guys who know Detroit sports. The voice of reason, Greg Eno and Big Al Beaton.
It's March 25th, 2018. That also means it's time for the Knee Jerks, Detroit Sports Talk with Eno and Big Al. I'm the Big Al of the equation, Al Beaton, longtime Detroit-based podcaster and blogger. And actually, over the past 2 weeks, serious basketball watcher. But we'll get into all that. Joining me, as always, is the man who knows a lot of things about a lot of things. He is should be on Iron Chef. And also, one of these days, maybe we'll put out a best-selling book, and that would be Greg Eno of numerous places on the web, which he will tell you. Greg, how's things?
Things are well, Al. Thanks for the intro. Appreciate that.
Not a best-selling book or anything, but
well, we have an author on the show, so that's appropriate that you brought that up. I am Greg. You can listen to me on here on the Knee Jerks, of course. You can read me on my WordPress Out of Bounds blog. Just Google Greg Eno WordPress or Out of Bounds WordPress or Greg Eno Out of Bounds or whatever combination you want to do. You'll find me. And of course, my Red Wings /hockey blog is also on WordPress, The Winged Wheeler. Check that out. Follow me on Twitter at Greg Eno. Follow the Knee Jerks on Twitter at the Knee Jerks. Our Facebook fan page is facebook.com/the Knee Jerks. We have a Knee Jerks group on Facebook. You can check out as well. So that's how you can find us on social media. What very special program tonight. I promoted this last time we were with you. We're going to be joined by author and St. Louis Cardinals historian Larry Underwood. And you might say, why? Well, this is the 50th anniversary, of course, of the Tigers-Cardinals World Series. And with the opening day baseball coming up this week, we thought it would be nice to kind of take a trip down memory lane and recall that series, but also we'll talk a little bit about both franchises, their history. I was doing some research about that, and I was amazed at some of the parallels I found out I discovered between the Tigers and the Cardinals, starting all the way back in the 1930s. So we'll get into a little bit of that. We'll talk about the World Series, kind of take you game by game. Larry will help us with the Cardinals' perspective, and Al and I will take the Tigers' perspective, of course. Then we'll talk about the two franchises, the directions they went in after that World Series, and how they kind of both fell in some hard times until the 80s. So it'll be kind of a fun thing to do. We haven't really done anything like that on the show, so I'm looking forward. Larry Underwood, who is our guest, we'll bring him in. We'll tell you more about him in a little bit, and he's a return guest to the Knee Jerks. So we got that going on. Now, why don't you fill folks in on what's happening with how you can get access to the podcast.
All right. As always, we have the mothership, the kneejerks.net, which will take you right to our podcast page at our new host, which is Libsyn. Just kneejerks.net. All the podcast information will be there, along with links to social media. As always, there's the kneejerks.us, which is our blog. And for that matter, we are on iTunes. The old podcast links have been taken off of iTunes. It's all the new stuff now. Again, if you want to listen to the podcast, the Knee Jerks, Eno and Big Al, just search for that on iTunes. And as well, we have Stitcher is up and running again under the same page and everything. Nothing's changed there at all. So your links to Stitcher will continue to work. Don't need to change a thing. And of course, we're working on other ways to get the podcast out there. But obviously, we have our Facebook group, we have our Facebook page, the Twitter account, so on and so forth. All the information will be there. But the main ways to get the podcast, go to the kneejerks.net, iTunes, and, of course, Stitcher, the Knee Jerks, Eno and Big Al. That's all you need to know.
Wonderful. Good stuff. We got lots on the docket. In addition to this Tigers-Cardinals retrospect, we're going to talk about some, of course, the March Madness continues on with Michigan making the Final Four. We got some Lions news with Eric Ebron being released. We've got some Red Wings stuff, some Pistons. We got really all the whole gamut.
Yes,
if we can get to it.
Exactly.
A caveat to tonight's show. Al and I are we don't know how long this segment's going to take with Larry, so we're just going to kind of play it by ear in terms of what we get to. So if we don't get to everything on the docket, we apologize ahead of time. But before we get to any of that, though, it's time to play a game we like to call Whose Birthday Is It, Maestro?
We baked you a birthday cake. If you get a tummy ache and you moan and groan and woe, don't forget we told you so. Happy birthday! Happy birthday!
Everybody knows how we play this game by now. I'll give Al a clue or two or three of an individual whose birthday it is today in the world of sports. And if Al can correctly guess that person within the first two clues, he will receive Rock'em Sock'em Robots.
Oh, yeah, I'll put that right next to me, Hungry Hippos. So,
Al, this person it made his name in baseball. He was born on this date in 1966. He's still very much with us, of course. He was... I will tell you that he spent his entire career, I believe, let me double check this. He spent his entire career in the National League. He spent his entire career on the mound. And I will tell you that he is an icon with the primary team he played with, which is below the Mason-Dixon line.
Ah, no, that...
I know it.
Larry, don't say anything.
I know it.
Oh, geez. I got to remember how many teams were behind the Mason-Dixon line when we're talking that era. Oh, shoot. And the ages we're talking about. Oh, shoot. You know what? I'm not sure. I'm sure Larry's holding his tongue right now, but his vote doesn't count. So I'm just going to pass. I'll ask you. You'll ask me after the interview for the second question, and let's get to our interview. Let's get to Larry.
Sure. Larry Underwood is with us. He was on the program many, many years ago talking about a book he had written on the Cardinals, I believe, and he's back with us to help us celebrate the 50th anniversary, as I said at the top of the show, of the 1968 World Series. There's nobody better to talk about this series from the Cardinals' perspective, or to talk about the Cardinals as far as that goes, than Larry Underwood. If you go to his Twitter handle, which is LAU56, you'll see pinned at the top the St. Louis Cardinals IQ, the ultimate test of true fandom, which is his latest book about the Cardinals. Terrific, the history of the Cardinals, which is, to me, one of the most iconic franchises in all of sports, forget just baseball.
Yes.
I believe the Cardinals have won, Larry, the most World Series, second to the Yankees. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
Yep. So
12 or 11. I beg your pardon.
Yeah,
they're going for 12.
Quite a few World Series. The iconic uniforms that haven't really changed in 80 years, and one of my favorite franchises, frankly. Not so much in 2006, but other than that,
I loved them in 2006.
Yeah, I know, of course. Anyway, Larry's here to help us talk about the 1968 World Series. But before we do that, Larry, just kind of fill us in on this latest book you've got pinned on Twitter, what you've been up to, and how things are going.
Well, that book was written actually in 2010, and I did a second volume, which was written a year later. But that's about it as far as my writing endeavors go. I've been laying low. I'm retired now, and just posting a lot of tweets about baseball in general. But surprisingly enough, the book, the first edition, is still selling fairly well. So I get nice little royalty checks once a year. So people still want to know about the Cardinals and all the trivia. Of course, you could write another book, another edition, because it's been so long. There's so much more stuff you could write about. It never ends, all the trivia you can dig up on any baseball team, really, but
right,
especially the Cardinals. But
yeah.
I thought we were here to talk about the 2006 World Series, guys. That's what we're talking about.
That was just to get you on the show.
Okay. Now, the 1968 was a great series. It brings back a lot of good memories. Of course, Game 7 was probably the most painful memory for me in my entire rooting career. It took me till 1982 to get over that one.
Right, I can imagine.
It was a great series.
It was a great series. We'll get into that, but before we do, I just wanted to kind of mention, like I said at the top of the program, that doing the research, prepping for the show, I was amazed at how how many parallels there were between the Tigers and the Cardinals' history. In the mid-'30s, of course, the Tigers faced the Cardinals in the 34 World Series, as you know, and lost in a 7-game series. Tigers came back and won the World Series in 35, and the Cardinals were winning pennants left and right. The first half of the decade of the 40s, they won the World Series in 41. They won in 41? Didn't they beat the Red Sox?
No, they won in 42.
42.
They beat the Yankees. They beat the Yankees in 42. Yeah, they had a good pennant race with the Dodgers in 41. Dodgers ultimately won that deal. And then the Cardinals and Dodgers had another classic pennant race in 42. I think the Cardinals won 106 games, and the Dodgers won 104. It was ridiculous.
And a 154-game season, too, by the way. 154
games. Too. And then they won the World Series in 43, lost the Yankees, and then they beat the crosstown rival, well, they showed the same ballpark, St. Louis Browns in 44.
Right.
And then the only reason they didn't get back to the World Series in 1945 was because Stan Musial was in the Navy that year, and the Cubs snuck in. Right. And of course, they lost to your Tigers.
Right. So the Tigers, so they got the 34-35 scenario I talked about. The Tigers won the pennant in 40, lost to the Reds. And then the Cardinals went on their run. And then the Tigers beat the Cubs, like you said, in 45. And then both teams were kind of laid low until the early 60s when the Cardinals, of course, won the 64 pennant. And we'll get into the minutiae of that in a second. I just want to kind of take people through the history where the parallels are. And that was right around the time the Tigers were getting good again. And the Tigers, of course, painful last day of the season loss in 67, losing the pennant, and then which the Cardinals won and won the World Series. They faced the Tigers in 68. Tigers won. And so the parallels are amazing. And then both teams kind of lost their way in the 70s. And then you mentioned, as you said earlier, the Cardinals won the World Series in 82, beating the Brewers. Tigers came back and won the World Series in 84. Both teams were in the playoffs in 87. Twins, of course, beat the Tigers and then went along and beat the Cardinals in the World Series. So and then, of course, they met in the World Series in 2006, the Tigers and the Cardinals. So a lot of parallels. Larry, kind of talk about that. That's kind of interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's funny because in 2012, when the Tigers played the Giants, the Cardinals were one game away from winning that series over the Giants in the NLCS. Mm-hmm. So it could have been another repeat performance between the two teams. So it really is amazing that, both teams need to do well at the same time and not so well at the same time, too. So, but it is a fascinating study.
Before we go into the 68 series, I want to kind of talk about the years leading up to 68 for both franchises. Larry, the 64 team, of course, won that very iconic. Well, there was a very iconic collapse by the Phillies, as you know, in '64, and it was also the year that the Cardinals traded for Lou Brock, the famous Lou Brock for Ernie Broglio trade in '64 with the Cubs, and Brock obviously was the catalyst. You really gave that team a shot in the arm. Talk about Brock's joining the 64 team and how that led to the eventual pennant and then, of course, the World Series.
Yeah, without Brock, the Cardinals don't even come close to winning that pennant. I believe he had 345 when he got traded over to the Cardinals. I think he was on the June 16th or somewhere around there was when he came over. Was just the catalyst, basically. Was what the Cardinals needed. Was somebody at the top of the order that could run, score runs, just hit for average, hit for power. He really did it all. He wasn't a good defensive left fielder. That was his only drawback, but he was definitely the catalyst. Now, of course, Ken Boyer won the Most Valuable Player award that year. I think he led the National League in RBIs, 114. And I think he played in every inning of every game, which is just unheard of these days. But, it was just a fantastic season. I remember that quite well as just a little kid. And was thrilled to death because, up to that point, the Cardinals had never won a pennant in my lifetime. So I was thrilled. And I was really quite shocked when they beat the Yankees. I thought the Yankees were invincible, but I didn't, at the time, I didn't realize that they were kind of on the downhill slide a little bit. They were getting a little older and not quite the team they were earlier in the decade. But that was a great series, just where Bob Gibson became kind of an icon. And, from that point forward, he was my favorite player of all time.
We're talking with St. Louis Cardinals historian and author Larry Underwood here on the Knee Jerks. I'm Greg Eno from WordPress, blogs, Out of Bounds, and The Wing Wheeler. And Big Al Beaton is here with us. We'll bring him in a second. The funny thing, too, Larry, about the 64 season was that after that season, the Yankees fired Berra, Yogi Berra is the manager, and hired Johnny Keane, who was the Cardinals manager in 64. And that started a down period, of course, for the Yankees. Keane went to the Yankees, and the Yankees kind of fell off the radar there for a few years. And then the Cardinals brought in Red Shandies. Is that not correct?
Right. The interesting story about Johnny Keane was he'd gotten rumor that Gussie Busch, the Cardinals owner, was planning on firing him. This is about mid-August or so. So he found out about that. In fact, there were rumors that Leo Durocher was going to come in and manage the Cardinals, but of course that never transpired. But at the same time, Keane was very, very bitter about that whole situation. So when they won the World Series, he basically said, "I'm out of here." That was it.
Good for him. And
but going to the Yankees was not a good move for him.
No, it wasn't good for him in the sense that he told them to stick it. But as it turned out, the directions of the two teams were almost totally opposite. You mentioned Brock and Gibson, and of course, they were two of the best World Series performers of all time as far as I'm concerned. Brock just killed the Yankees in 64, killed the Red Sox in 67, killed the Tigers in 68.
In 64, Brock had a good series. It wasn't great.
He wasn't great, but I think he had 300, though.
Yeah, he had 300, but didn't steal any bases, which I thought was kind of amazing. Yeah. He stole 7 bases in 67. He stole 7 bases in 68, but 0 bases in 64.
You look at the body of his work for those 3 series, it blows. It makes Reggie Jackson look like nothing.
I believe he got 390 career.
Yeah, he was incredible. And then, of course, Gibson did what he did in the World Series as well. The Tigers, meanwhile, Al, kind of help me out here. The Tigers in 64, 65, that mid-60s time frame when all that, the core of that 68 team kind of came together. I want you to kind of talk about, fill the viewers and listeners in on those teams leading up to the 68, the Tigers.
Well, it's the parallels to the 84 team. There's a lot there because essentially the core of that team came up as a group. Other than Al Kaline had at that point had been there. He was the veteran of the team. Really, he was pushing. By 68, he was well into his 30s. Which is hard to believe. Because he was at that point. Al Kaline was a 6 to a 7 WAR player every year. That's just how good he was. How good his defense was as well. But the majority of that team, basically came up together. Were brought up at pretty much the close in that same era, except for a couple of the guys. Norm Cash was essentially stolen from the Chicago White Sox, for example. But majority of that team, the Stanleys, the Hortons, the Northrups, Freehands, they were all homegrown players, including most of the guys on the pitching staff as well. And realistically, they were good enough. They should have won in 1967 if they hadn't blown that doubleheader to the Angels of all teams on the final day of the year. That's still to this day probably considered, if not the best pennant race of all time. It's one of the top pennant races where literally, I believe there was like 4 or 5 teams that could have won the pennant on the last couple of days of the season, depending on how things broke. And it ended up being the Red Sox who ended up pulling it off. But that team, for a person of a certain age, over 50, realistically. When you hear names like Freehand, McAuliffe, Cash, Willie Horton, Mickey Stanley, Jim Northrup, Jim Price is still out there today because he's on the radio broadcast for the Tigers. He was the backup catcher in those teams. But of course, when it really comes down to it, though, it was the dead ball era. I'm sorry, the second dead ball era, I should put it. So pitching dominated, and the Tigers had some dominant pitchers, led by, of course, Denny McLain and Mickey Lolich, who were really. Denny McLain was at the peak of his powers, and Mickey Lolich was coming into his own as one of the best left-handers in baseball. A strikeout artist. And if you look at the numbers of the pitching staff that they put up that year, the numbers are ridiculous. Not as ridiculous as Bob Gibson's. If you look at his numbers, oh my God! But they were essentially in 1968. After they had been building up to this point, much like if you want to talk about the 1984 Tigers did the same thing. They had a near miss in 67, and essentially in 68 was this core group. It was we're going to win the World Series or bust, because this was essentially their time. And as we all know what happened from there. But 68 was going to be their year. And also factor in all this, Greg, people have to remember, was the tensions in the city itself, especially coming from the riots of 67, which was in a lot of ways what happened in 67 was what the Tigers did a little bit of healing with their play in 68, and they've even said that. But also, I guess there is one other thing to bring up about all this, Greg, is also there was a newspaper strike in the middle of all this.
In 68,
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
in 68. So there was absolutely no newspaper coverage at all of this team. And so essentially it was radio or bust if you wanted to follow the Tigers at that point.
That's a good point, and that's interesting that a lot of folks outside of Detroit probably don't even know about is that newspaper strike, which, like you said, ate up the bulk of that season. I think it got settled in time for the World Series. It was settled in time
for the end of the season. But the majority of the regular season, both big newspapers, the News and Free Press, were on strike.
Right, exactly. Back to Larry Underwood, our guest, St. Louis Cardinals historian. The 67 Cardinals, Larry, of course, had to face the impossible dream Red Sox. And that's a tricky spot for a team that the Cardinals, who were obviously, I'm sure were favorites heading into that series. But whenever you're going up against that magic pixie dust, which is what got the Orioles in 69 against the Mets. When you're going up against those Cinderella teams, that can be a little tricky. But the Cardinals ended up, I believe, winning Game 7 on the road in that series.
Right, Gibson beat what's his name?
Lonborg.
Lonborg. I remember the day before, the manager of the Red Sox, Dick Williams, was quoted as saying what he plans for Game 7 is Lonborg and champagne. And I tell you what, that quote was definitely pinned up on the Cardinal clubhouse because after they won the World Series, they were in the clubhouse chanting Lonborg and champagne, Lonborg and champagne. It was beautiful. I loved it. But yeah, that was a series which I didn't know was going to happen. I really thought the Red Sox actually would win that thing, especially they were down 3-1 like the Tigers were in 68. Right. And they damn near came back and won. I was just like really worried.
Right.
But I guess after Gibson won Game 7, I thought in my mind, this guy is invincible. He will never lose a World Series game. So that's why I felt very confident going into 68. I said, well, Gibson he'll win 1, 4, and 7. All I got to do is find one other guy to win a game. But it didn't work out that way, did it?
No, it didn't. I remember talking to Jim Northrup one time about 68 and about a lot of things, and he told me that the team came to spring training in 68 with one of the biggest chips on their shoulders you'll ever find because of what happened in 67. They were genuinely ticked off about that. They really thought that they were the better team in 67, and it really chapped their butt that they didn't win that pennant. And so they came to camp in 68 determined that nobody was going to beat them, that they were the best team in the American League, hands down. And they went out and proved it. And they just did. There was I think they took over first place in mid-May and from the Orioles and never looked back. They kept the Orioles kind of at arm's length all summer. Every time the Orioles would get maybe within 4, 5, 6 games, the Tigers would pull back ahead again by 8, 9, 10 games again, and they just were not to be headed off. And so we all know about Detroit. The listeners here who are mainly Detroit people on our podcast, of course, know a lot about that year. But from the Cardinals' perspective, Larry, going into the season as defending champs, were there tell us about any challenges or any pitfalls that 68 Cardinals team had to encounter? I know there wasn't really a super duper intense pennant race necessarily, and Gibson was otherworldly with that 1.12 ERA. But was there anything that happened during the course of the year that gave Shandy's any sort of concern?
Well, I'll tell you what, it was kind of a weird season. The Cardinals started out on opening night. This is like kind of typical. Gibson pitches opening night. He goes 7 innings, allows 1 run, and it was an unearned run. And he was relieved after a pinch hit for him in the 7th inning. Ray Washburn comes in and pitches 2 innings. The Cardinals score a couple runs, and they win a walk-off game 2-1. That was kind of a typical way for Gibson. He just never had any luck. I mean, he starts out the season, he no earned runs allowed, and doesn't get a decision.
Right.
In fact, by May, I think it was May 28th, he lost a game to Gaylord Perry after Willie Mays hit a 2-run home run, and his record was 3-5.
Wow.
On May the 28th. His ERA was like 150 something or other, and then after that I think he decided that the only way I can win these games is if I shut them out. Right. I think he took like 4 shutouts in a row after that, and the Cardinals were sailing after that. But yeah, the Cardinals were a game over 500 on May the 29th, and then they won 9 games in a row, and they went from 4th place, 3 games out, to 1st place, and then they were never headed. They had a fantastic June and July. I think they went like 47 and 15 or whatever it was in those 2 months, and then by the mid-August, they were up by 15 games, and every succeeding game for that was about as exciting as the spring training game. It was just like, oh wait, whatever. They just kind of stumbled home. They didn't really worry about it. The pennant was already won by the middle of August.
Right. Yeah.
But the other thing,
go ahead.
I was going to say, the only drawback they had was their offense was not very good. And Orlando Cepeda, who was the most valuable player in '67, had a terrible year, comparatively speaking, in '68. So that was really the only thing that concerned me as a fan was what's wrong with Cepeda. I mean, everybody else was doing okay, but Cepeda was in the process of hitting 248, slugging under 400. I mean, Dal Maxwell, of all people, had a higher batting average than Orlando Cepeda that year.
Wow.
But of course, their pitching was so good it didn't matter. They didn't need much offense. But the thing is, Gibson only won 22 games with that 1.12 ERA.
Al hit on it earlier when he talked about the second dead ball era. That was the year, of course, '68 was the year that Yastrzemski won the American year of the pitcher. The year that Yastrzemski won the batting title in the American League with a 301 average. And, of course, the Major League Baseball lowered the mound in '69. But I want to get back to Gibson. I always thought one of the most amazing things about that year wasn't that he had a 1.12 ERA, and that he threw 13 shutouts. It was that he lost 9 games.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's why I'm looking back on it, I shouldn't have been surprised that he lost Game 7, because after all, he went 22-9 with a 1.12 ERA. So yeah, what's wrong with that picture?
And that Game 7 was, and we'll get to Game 7, of course, in a little bit, but that was kind of the microcosm of his season, because he ended up locked in a pitching duel with Lolich, and the Cardinals once again, couldn't get him any runs. Let's bring back Al Beaton back into the discussion. Al, talk about the Tigers ace, Denny McLain in '68. 31 wins. Obviously, we all know about Denny's life after baseball, but talk about just that particular year that he had.
First off, the numbers are absolutely insane. Especially when you compare them to today. He had 41 starts, which is about 10 to probably 12 more than, say, like a Justin Verlander would today. He had 336 innings pitched. Let's see. Let me bring up his page here. He led the league in innings pitched, led the league in the complete games. He had 28 complete games. And actually, Bob Gibson, if you look at the numbers, his are very similar as well when it comes to innings pitched.
Yeah, 28 complete games as well.
Exactly. And also, the numbers are, he had a whip of below 1. That's like shutdown reliever territory. His whip was 0.9, and actually Bob Gibson's was less than that. ERA was, I believe, for McLain in that year. That year, for example, was, let's see if I can bring it up here. Yeah, 1.96. So the numbers were absolutely insane. And you got to remember though, people forget just how dominant of a pitcher Denny McLain was from about 66 to 69, you can make an argument he was the best pitcher in the American League. If not for Gibson, maybe the best starting pitcher of all of baseball. But the innings pitched that he was putting up are absolutely insane. And there was also the fact that Denny McLain, in '68 especially, some of his it was becoming known for some of the things he would pull off, like drinking a case of, I believe, Pepsi a day. He flew his own airplane, so there was controversy about, flying. He wanted to fly around the country, fly to games, things like that. There was the organ playing. People tend to forget about. He actually released albums of his organ playing. Things like that. I mean, we're talking that year. McLain became a huge celebrity, basically because of the chase for 30 wins, which hadn't been done in decades. And his personality, and in Detroit, we all know what his personality like, how outgoing and maybe overbearing he could be. But he was undeniably amazingly talented. But you could also say that it's undeniable that his arm was abused. And the fact that after 1969, he was never, ever the same pitcher again compared to what he was at his peak. I mean, he was essentially done as a pitcher by the age of, say, 25, so 26 years old.
Right.
Which is a damn shame, but that was the era. That's just how guys were back then. You started a game, you completed a game. The goal was to go 9 innings and pitch counts be damned. And in that era, Denny McLain, as good as he was, didn't take care of himself that well, and the Tigers abused him. But for those few years, especially in '68, where everything came together, I mean, you can make an argument that pitcher wins aren't the best way to tell how good a pitcher is in a year, but you can't deny 31 wins is absolutely insane, and it was just kind of the cherry on top of all the other absolutely ridiculous numbers he put up that year. And
he had a chance to start that year.
Lucky, he should have won 30 games himself because he was even more dominant.
Well, yeah, he started 34 games. I'm thinking McLain must have started more than 34 games, though, didn't he?
41, I think.
41.
How many? Oh, my God.
Games he started. I know,
that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. He started 34 games. He threw 304 innings, I believe.
McLain had a shot at a 32nd victory, I think, at the last weekend of the season against the Senators, and didn't win. So he could have had 32 victories. The thing I want to talk about before we get into Game 1, you couldn't get a more between these two ace pitchers, McLain and Gibson. You couldn't get further apart in terms of their personalities. I mean, you just couldn't get any. I mean, they were just two opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to that. But I want to talk about Gibson real quick, Larry, before we get into the World Series itself. In 1965, Gibson surrendered a league-high 34 home runs, and then I'm looking at his line after that, and then all of a sudden, he gave up. Here's the home runs that he allowed in the next 6, 7, 8 years after that: 20, and then 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 12. What did he do to cut those home runs? And those are with a lot of innings pitched. What did he do to cut down on the home runs allowed?
Well, I don't know. That is amazing. I know in 68 he was so dominant, he gave up 11 home runs.
Right.
But yeah, boy, I didn't know about that 65. That is a staggering amount of home runs. Of course, it reminds me of Robin Roberts, as great as he was for the Phillies. He used to give up home runs all the time. Nolan Ryan used to give up a lot of home runs. Mm-hmm. So he was, I guess, just a fastball pitcher. Just said, here, if you can hit it, hit it. And I don't maybe he didn't have his slider repertoire going for him by until later on, maybe in 66, 67, 68. But 34 home runs. But his ERA was still barely over 3. So
right.
I guess he must have given up a lot of solo home runs. He pitched. He won 20 games.
Well, that's
3.07 ERA.
Yeah. Heading into the series now, here comes Game 1 now, and the Tigers didn't have much of neither team really had a sweat a pennant race. And both teams kind of cruised into their respective pennants. Nobody was really threatened. So it was several weeks ahead of time. Everybody knew it was going to be a Tigers Cardinals World Series. Everybody knew it was going to be Gibson and McLain would be the two aces. And it turned out, as the series went on, the McLain wasn't much of a factor. It was Lolich, who, by the way, and I wrote a column on him over the weekend. Lolich, who ran into some major problems mid-season, even got banished to the bullpen for about 3 weeks. That's how bad he was before he got his act together. But so, anyways, the World Series comes, and here comes Game 1 now, and we all know what happened in Game 1. Gibson strikes out, breaks Sandy Koufax's World Series record, strikes out 17 Tigers. And Larry, maybe as dominant of a World Series performance as you're ever going to see, correct?
Yeah, and the thing is, the scouts for the Tigers, when they were telling what to expect from Gibson, they just mentioned his fastball. They didn't mention his slider. So that's why Gibson struck out so many batters, because they weren't expecting that slider. He got a lot of strikeouts from that slider. That was the key. I think, of course, by Game 7, they had it figured out a little bit, especially Northrup. Who also, by the way, homered in Game 4 off of Gibson, the 10-1 blowout win. Which another thing, when you're winning, I guess they're up 6-1 by the fifth inning. You wonder, looking back on it, why didn't Shane Bean take him out a little bit earlier in that game to give him a little more rest, so by Game 7 he'd be fresh as a daisy? But back in those days, Gibson, of course, would never want to come out of a game.
No.
But they never gave it a consideration.
No, you'd risk your health if you try to take Gibson out of the game.
But a complete game 10-1 win. That was, in Game 4 when you got Game 7 coming up.
Yeah, no, I hear you. But like you said, that was just the mindset. But in Game 1, you look at some of those. If you fire up that game on YouTube and you look at some of those strikeouts, which some of them were looking, by the way, they weren't all swing and misses. There were a lot of looking strikeouts. In fact, the one that I think the best slider he may have thrown the entire game was the last pitch he threw of the entire game, which is the one
that Horton,
Rose Horton. I mean, it was almost that should almost be outlawed. I mean, that pitch was
that was ridiculous.
And Willie had no chance. He was frozen like a statue, and one of the best sliders I've ever seen. And you talked about the scouting reports, but the other scouting report, the other thing, of course, we didn't really talk about, Al. I'm going to bring Al back in here. Heading into the World Series was, of course, the switch of Mickey Stanley from outfield to shortstop. Talk about that, Al.
Yeah, that's the essentially it's become legendary in Detroit. The ballsy move it took for Mayo Smith to find a way to essentially get Al Kaline back in the lineup, because Kaline missed a lot of 68 due to the injuries, so it essentially left the Tigers with a 4-man outfield with Northrup, Stanley. Horton, I believe Horton left, Stanley in center, Northrup in right, and no place to play Al Kaline. No, this is something Kaline's been essentially playing his whole career for. At this point, I think Kaline's 33 years old, and he's been in the league 15 years at this point. So, obviously, if you look at the numbers, the left side of the Tigers' infield they couldn't hit, pure and simple. Ray Euler and Don Wirt. Ray Euler was a shortstop. Don Wirt was your third baseman. Ray Euler, his OPS for the year was .399, which pretty much says it all right now. He hit 135 on the season with an on-base percentage of .213. So Mickey Stanley was a world-class athlete, and he was talented enough to pretty much play where the Tigers needed him to, and to have the best overall offensive lineup, which the Tigers were going to need against Bob Gibson. The only way to get those four outfielders into the lineup and make for a better offensive lineup was to take Euler out, move Stanley from center field to shortstop, shift Northrup to center, and then put Al Kaline back in right field. And the thing, anybody could pull that off today. Could you imagine, you have a guy who played a Gold Glove center fielder. Mickey Stanley was no slouch in the outfield. I mean, he was a Gold Glove center fielder. And for 7 games, he said, we're going to play you at shortstop. And he didn't embarrass himself at shortstop at all. He handled pretty much everything that was hit to him. Thank God there was no major controversies coming from this. But, that was that was probably, if Mayo Smith is not known as a great manager per se. I mean, the Tigers won because they just had the horses.
Right.
But if you got to give Mayo Smith credit for one thing, how many managers would do that going into the damn World Series?
Right.
Moving your Gold Glove center fielder to shortstop and it working. I could not see that happen today. But the Tigers had to do something to get their best lineup on the field. The only way they could do that was moving Stanley to shortstop.
And by the way, let's also set the record straight here that this was not something that Al Kaline went into Mayo Smith's office and said, I want to play in the World Series, damn it. As a matter of fact, if anything, Kaline was ready to acquiesce and say, look, because Kaline, let's back up a little bit. Kaline broke his wrist earlier in the season. He got hit by a pitch by Lou Krause of the A's, and he broke his wrist, was out for, 6-7 weeks or whatever. Came back and played first base a little bit because they had the outfield, like you said, Stanley, Northrup, and Horton. And so Mayo would put Al in the lineup against left-handers, especially at first base, to replace Norm Cash. But come the World Series, you didn't want to take Cash's bat out of the lineup, of course. Right. So And Gibson was right-handed, and there wasn't really a tough left-hander on the Cardinals staff that was really intimidating. So they decided that they would go ahead and do this move. But this was something that Beilein did not initiate. In fact, he was willing to sit the World Series out and only be available as a pinch hitter, which is amazing. This is, he played his entire career to be in the World Series, and here comes the chance, and he's willing to sit it out.
Yeah. So we have to. A great World Series, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Right, he was 11 for 20.
He was phenomenal.
Right. So, again, that was another sidebar about that. So game one comes and goes. It's 4-0 victory for the Cardinals. They get off on the right foot. Gibson 17 strikeouts. McClain didn't pitch poorly, but Gibson was just that much dominant. The Cardinals scored 3 runs in the 4th inning. That was essentially all they needed, of course. And then they take game one. Game two, though, is interesting because for a couple of reasons. Obviously, Lolich was the first of his 3 complete game victories, but Mickey hits a home run off Nelly Briles, the only home run Mickey ever hit in his entire baseball career, going back to the minor leagues, maybe even going back to the Little League. And if you look at the video on that, Mickey was so surprised he missed first base on the trot, so he had to go back and touch it. But that was also kind of a key hit in that series, in that game as well. What do you remember about game two, Larry?
All I remember was Lolich dominated the Cardinals. It was an easy win for the Tigers. I know Lolich hit a home run, but as far as I can remember, that game was just over almost before it began. It was 8-1. So, I don't even think much about that game because it was like, whatever. It was funny because going into the series, Roger Maris said, "Tell you what, guys, the pitcher to look out for on the Tigers is Mickey Lolich." Yeah. Not necessarily Danny McClain. He was more concerned about Mickey Lolich because he'd faced him before. He knew how tough he was, and Cardinals had a little bit of trouble with left-handers that year.
Yeah, and Maris was a left-handed hitter, so I can see why he would say that.
Yeah. So he said, "Hey, Mickey Lolich is the guy you ought to be looking out for," and sure enough, he was awesome.
Right.
I think for the World Series, his ERA was what I think the same as Gibson's. I think they both were at 1.75 or something like that.
Yeah.
In fact, Gibson and Lolich each homered in that series, and each of them had a 500 slugging percentage in that series.
Interestingly enough, I'm looking at the box score from that game, and Maris did not play in that game. Red sat him down. He did not play in game two. Ron Davis, who I barely remember, played right field that day.
Okay, I forgot about that too. That's interesting because obviously Maris probably wanted no part of Lolich.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that, and exactly. But we'll go on and see if Maris played in games 4 or games 5 and 7. But anyway, so now it's 1-1. They go back to Detroit, and then things start to turn bad for the Tigers. The Cardinals win game 3 and 4 in Detroit. They blew out McClain in game 4, just completely demolished him. They beat Earl Wilson in game 3. So let's go back to game 3 now. Earl Wilson starts, the only time that Wilson started in that series, he starts game 3. It's in Detroit, first World Series game in Detroit in 23 years. And here comes Ray Washburn starting game 3 for the Cardinals. And they win at 7-3. They get 4 runs in the 5th inning. But again, Brock, 3 hits. What made Brock such a great World Series player, do you think? I mean, he was just phenomenal.
It's hard to define greatness, but I guess he just had so much just fortitude and will to succeed when the spotlight was shining brightest, and he was able to rise to the occasion. It's just inexplicable. He was a good ball player to begin with, but in the World Series he turned into just some kind of god. It was just unbelievable.
He was.
I mean, you could argue that he should have won the MVP for the series in '67, but of course, how can you argue with Gibson going 3-0 against the Red Sox? But but Brock was on another planet when it came to World Series. He's just like, you can't stop me.
Kurt Flood also, by the way, we talk a lot about Brock as we should, but Kurt Flood who hit behind Brock was a thorn in the side as well. That series. Flood was a very good player, underrated, excellent center fielder. He got 2 hits in that game, so they got 13 hits. They blew out Earl Wilson, who didn't even last through the 5th inning. They win that game 7-3, so now they're up 2-1. But the big one, the game that I thought really that I think probably crushed the Tigers' fans' hopes, was Game 4, because they thought, okay, we've got McLean coming back now. Granted, it's going to be against Gibson, but you're down 2-1, and you say, well, we've got our 31-game winner who did not pitch poorly, like I said, in Game 1. He really didn't. But Gibson was just so good. And if I remember correctly, there was some rain that day. It was a rainy day, and I think the game was delayed a couple of times. And, of course, Brock, 3 more hits, 4 RBIs. And McLean is just absolutely shelled. He only lasts 2 2/3, gives up 6 hits, 4 runs, 3 of them are earned. He's out of there early. The Cardinals win 10-1, and I think everybody left the ballpark that day thinking that this was going to be a Cardinals triumph. What about Game 4? We'll get to Al in a second, but Larry, Game 4, again, Brock is huge. McCarver had 3 hits, so they had 13 hits. They killed McLean. Just kind of talk about that.
I just remember that was a cakewalk. It was fun to watch from my perspective. It was a Sunday. I remember that, and I remember thinking after they won Game 4 and went up 3-1 that the series was essentially over because they got Gibson. At worst case scenario, Gibson would be pitching Game 7.
Right.
And of course, I just assumed that he would win Game 7.
Right.
But the Tigers obviously said we're not through yet. We got Lolich coming back for Game 5, and even though the Cardinals jumped out to a 3-0 lead in the first inning, Lolich seemed unflappable. And of course, the key play in Game 5 was the Brock failing to slide.
We'll get that. We'll get to that in a second, but I want to get back to Game 4. Gibson hit a home run in that game. Hit one off Joe.
Yeah, hit a home run in the game. Yeah, and again.
I was going to say Gibson was a pretty good hitting. Gibson was not a bad hitting pitcher. He really wasn't.
Yeah, he homered in 67 series in Game 7, as I recall, too.
Sure did.
But you see, Gibson, looking back on hindsight, it's always 20/20, 50 years later. If Gibson would have come out of that game maybe in the 6th or 7th inning, because they were up to 6-1 after 4. Of course, Gibson was never going to come out of the game. But looking back on it, had he come out of that game, he might have been a little fresher for Game 7. He was almost 33 years old.
Right.
I mean, let's face it. Your body's going to wear down a little bit. Even though, again, at the time, I thought he was like, Hercules. He's never going to lose. It's impossible. It's not in his DNA. But obviously, it didn't work out that way. I think he kind of ran out of gas in the 7th inning of Game 7 as he surrendered 4 hits in a row, 2 outs.
Well, Gibson did hit 24 home runs in his career. I knew he was a pretty good hitting pitcher. He hit a career batting average of 206, which for a pitcher isn't too bad.
That ain't bad.
24 home runs. He wasn't a bad hitting pitcher at all. Let's
bring a great athlete too.
He was a good
bases too.
Yeah,
he did everything.
Played for the Globetrotters for a while.
Right.
Let's bring Big Al back in. Al, what about Game 4? The Tigers go down 3-1. I'm assuming at that point the mood in Detroit is not good.
Yeah, series over. Series is over, because
Al, you there?
They're thinking we still have Bob Gibson.
Did we lose Al?
There
Al,
we go.
now
for a sec. There we go. Yeah, essentially in Detroit at that point they thought series is over. Because they're not going to beat Bob Gibson, and they have to beat Bob Gibson to win the World Series.
Right.
And there was a lot of oddball stuff going on in that. The Tigers essentially were forced, because of their situation, losing this game specifically, is that they ended up – their rotation was essentially 2 guys.
Right.
McLean and Lolich. Earl Wilson got 1 start,
right.
I think like 4 innings or something like that. Other than that, it was just those 2.
Right.
But, yeah, Gibson was so dominant in that 10-1 victory. Mm-hmm. I can't believe the Tigers even got any hits off him. He was that dominant.
The only hit. The only run was Jim Northrup's home run, which I guess would foretell what was going to happen in Game 7 with Northrup.
Gibson must be feeling generous or something, I'm guessing. But yeah, really, when it comes down to it, Brock is was so dominant, all over the field, and then you factor in Gibson so dominant on the mound. Tigers fans pretty much they thought it was fait accompli. This series is over. We're not going to beat these guys. Are playing at their peak of their powers. How are we going to beat them? Especially with Denny McLean becoming mortal. So really, after that 10-1 loss, people thought the series is over.
And the Tigers, not only would they have to win 3 games, but they have to win 2 of them in St. Louis.
2 of them in St. Louis, exactly.
And it just didn't look good. But Game 5 and that's the one that we're really. that's the one that probably people. I mean, obviously people talk about Game 7 clearly, but
that's the turning point right there.
Game 5, my goodness gracious! And Larry touched on it earlier. The Cardinals get off to a 3-0 lead in the very first inning off Lolich, and Tigers fans are going, "Here we go again!" And of course, the catalyst to that was Brock, as usual, who just murdered the Tigers, just murdered them. And they get 3 runs in the first inning, and before the fans are even seated, practically, they're up 3-0. And now it looks like, well, this is just going to be this. The season's going to end today. It's going to end on the Tigers' home field. But we have to, of course, talk about what happened in the sixth? What inning was the 7th inning or 6th inning? The Brock play. Let me see here.
I believe it was the 6th inning. Let me look back.
No,
here.
It's
It was the 5th.
5th.
Oh yeah, top of the 5th.
Brock out home.
Yeah.
5th inning. Yeah, 5th inning.
Yeah, one out double. He should have scored in a single. Horton made a great throw to the plate, but had Brock decided to slide feet first, good hard slide into home, he would have scored easily.
So let's set the stage now. Tigers got 2 runs in the 4th. It's 3-2 now, headed in the 5th inning. Lolich is getting stronger as the game goes on, but the Brock doubles with 1 out. He doubles, and then of course Julian Javier, who was a good player by the way, singled to left. And you mentioned Horton. If you look at the film of that play, Horton didn't actually field the ball that cleanly. It took him a little bit to get it out. He kind of fielded it at his waist, and it kind of took him just one extra beat to get the throw off, which normally would kill you, especially against a speedster like Brock. But he made, like you said, made as good of a throw as you're going to make from left field. And Willie was not known for his arm, but I mean he made a great throw. And the play that you're talking about, of course, Brock not sliding. What was the reasoning, Larry, that Lou gave for not sliding?
I don't think he had a good reason. He just said he thought he could sneak in there, and that was all there was to it. And he said he was safe. But if you look at the replay, it looks like he was out to me. Mm-hmm. And all I know is if he'd have slid in there, he would have been safe for sure. Right. But he never would admit that he did the wrong thing by not sliding. Right. Of course, Gibson used to tease him all the time about it constantly. Say, well, if you'd have slid, you'd have been in there. But he insists he was safe. But what can I say? And to me, that kind of turned the momentum of the entire series around because the Cardinals scored 3 runs in the first, no more runs in that game, 1 run apiece in the next 2 games. So over the course of 20-some odd innings, 26 innings, they scored 2 runs. Right. You're not going to win too many World Series doing that. Right. Unless Gibson pitches the shutout.
And had he scored, that would have made the score 4-2, and there only would have been 1 out. And who knows how many, if they would have scored another one, I don't know. But it made the score 4-2.
Anything could happen, right?
Right.
Yeah, you never know.
So it remains 3-2 at that point. And then the big hit in that game was in the Tigers' 7th when Beilein got a hit, scored 2 runs to put the Tigers at 4-3. That was the big hit of the game.
Gas got another hit right behind him too.
Right. And they scored another run, so it was 5-3. Tigers scored 3 runs in the 7th, and then this was another Lolich game, of course. So Lolich, of course, pitched complete game. Here's the other thing, guys, about that game too that a lot of folks kind of forget about. Mayo Smith, and Al talked about Mayo not being necessarily known as a great manager, but he was a fearless manager. And one of the things that he did in that game, he let Lolich hit in the 7th inning. Tigers were down 3-2. Wirt struck out, and then here comes Lolich now. There's 1 out, nobody on. So it's not even like he was there to sacrifice. Base is empty, 1 out. He's, as Larry said, no runs after the first inning for the Cardinals. Lolich is getting stronger as the game goes on, and Mayo had the wherewithal to let Lolich bat, which a lot of Al talked a little bit, or one of you guys talked about, gosh, that would never happen today. Well, this would never happen today either. I can guarantee you that. No manager would let his starting pitcher bat in the 7th inning of a game where they were trailing. He lets Lolich hit, who was not a good hitting pitcher, despite the home run in Game 2. And Lolich got a base hit.
Dumped in the right field, yeah.
And actually, Lolich started the rally. That initiated a pitching change. Joe Horner came in, replaced Bryles, and then the whole broke loose, and the Tigers scored 3 runs because of Lolich's single. That's what started the rally. And a lot of people don't talk about that. That Mayo letting Lolich stay in the game paid off, and of course he finishes the game, and they win 5-3, and the series is now 3-2. But again, it's you're back to St. Louis, and like Larry said, you've got Gibson in Game 7. But
hey, before you move on, one other piece of trivia about Game 5.
Yeah, sure.
That's the Jose Feliciano game.
Oh, with the national anthem.
With the famous
controversial,
very long controversial Star Spangled Banner, which today that's considered a classic, but back then it was considered insulting.
Very right.
And since it was so long, Mickey Lolich has always said the reason he gave up 3 runs in the first inning because he was warmed up and ready to go, and next thing you know, Jose Feliciano has this long national anthem, and he got cold.
That's right.
That I did not know. That's interesting.
That's a good job by Al, because that's exactly, he's right. Al's 100% right about that. That was, and the person behind that Feliciano thing, of course, was Ernie Harwell. The broadcaster. He was the one that brought Feliciano in.
Yeah.
Ernie, of course, dabbled in music himself and songwriting and so forth. And he brought Feliciano in, and Al's 100% correct about Lolich. That's exactly what Mickey has always said, and that's true. It's completely true.
But now that national anthem is considered one of the most iconic pieces of music that ever was. It's just
right up there with Marvin Gaye's version of the '84 All-Star Game in the NBA. Yeah. So anyway. So now it goes back to St. Louis. It's 3-2 Cardinals. They still got to be, but Larry, they still got to be feeling. I know that you're talking about when you mentioned the Brock thing. You and I have talked about this on Facebook. The Cardinals have still got to be thinking pretty good. I'm feeling pretty good about themselves. They're up 3-2. They're going home. They've got Gibson in Game 7 in their back pocket if they need it, and they're going up against McLean, who they shelled in Game 4. So they've got to be feeling pretty good about themselves. No.
Well, I don't know if they were or not, but I was just feeling good about the overall prospects. I just thought, well, you know what? If they lose Game 6, no big deal, because we got Gibby in Game 7. That was my mindset.
Right.
But yeah, obviously, I think that game was 13-1.
Yes.
I think there was a lot of rain. And it was just a miserable game to watch. But
Tigers scored 10 runs in the third inning. They scored 10 runs in the third inning.
Yeah, that's a pretty good inning.
They killed Washburn. And a bunch of guys, Jasper, Willis, they all got shelled.
Yeah,
and so that game was over.
That gave the Tigers a bit of momentum, obviously, I think.
Yeah, but Northrop hit another grand slam. He was known for hitting grand slams that year. I don't know how many he had. I think he hit 4 or 5 that year, and he hit one of the World Series.
Yeah, 8 RBIs in the World Series.
Yeah, and Northrop had a good series too. I mean, let's face it, he had a good series too.
Well, yeah, K-Line, Northrop, and Cash all had good series for Tigers.
Right,
very good.
Right. So it's 13-1. Not much to talk about other than that. I mean, it's 10 runs, which I think I'm not sure if that 10 runs in the third inning was a World Series record. Larry, do you know?
It could have been. I don't recall anybody scoring that many runs in a World Series game before.
In one inning. Yeah, I don't know either.
So it could have been.
Yeah. Anyways, regardless, it was 13-1. Tigers then. Now it's set
to go 9 innings.
What's that?
McLean goes 9 innings, goes complete game.
Right, McLean, right? 1 run, 9 hits. I mean, he McLean, he wasn't horrible. He had the one bad starting game. 4.
Yeah, his ERA was 3.24 in the World Series. That ain't shabby.
He was not. He was not. Let's face it. He wasn't the McLean that we saw in the regular season. Clearly. So now it's Game 7. It's a winner take all. Lolich is going to pitch on 2 days rest, which he had done in the past. And, of course, what Koufax did in 65, he went into Minnesota on 2 days rest and shut down the Twins to win that series, the only game that the road team won in that series. So it wasn't unusual in those days for pitchers to pitch on 2 days rest. But when you're talking about the World Series, you're talking about Game 7, you're talking about a 26-year-old guy like Lolich, who was not very good at times in the regular season. Now you're asking him, despite his 2 victories already, to go out there and pitch Game 7. Now, Mayo could have gone with – now, you would think, well, what could he have done instead? Well, he had a well-rested Earl Wilson, but I don't know if you give the ball to Earl Wilson in Game 7. He had a plethora – his whole bullpen ready to go. So he could have only thrown Lolich out there for a few innings and gone by committee. Lolich said years later that Mayo started asking him after about the 4th inning, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And Lolich said, "I'm a little bit tired, but I'm okay." He gets locked into a scoreless duel with the great Gibson of all people. I can't really imagine what's going through Lolich's mind as that game played out. And of course, the big hit was the 7th inning triple by Northrop. I got to ask you, I guess point blank, Larry. Northrop, of course, who told me that no way could Flood have caught that ball despite slipping.
Oh, no, never in a million years. I'll tell you what, when that ball was hit, I remember watching on television, when that ball was hit, I just screamed, no, because I knew that was trouble.
Right.
And I tell you what, then they show the replay, and then Flood, after the game admitted, I slipped, and it's all my fault. But nobody defended Northrop's, just clobbering the hell out of that ball.
Right.
They didn't have StatCast back in those days, but if they did, I bet his exit velocity was like 190 miles an hour. I mean, he just hit the daylights out of that ball. The only way Flood could have caught that ball would be if he had been 20 paces back, already, just playing 20 feet deeper, and then had he not slipped a little bit. But they made a big deal about him slipping on the wet grass. That didn't matter at all. That didn't change the play at all. I mean, it looked bad.
What did you think, Al? Do you think that ball was catchable?
No, I don't think so.
Not in a million years.
Mm-hmm. No, there's always been talk. I think like Denny McClain threw a little bit of the flames on that, saying that it was Flood's fault. And Flood's always said I couldn't have caught the ball because he's Kurt Flood. He always said he could catch everything.
Right.
But but the odds of him catching that would have been a miracle. It really would have been.
On dry turf, perhaps that he broke it immediately with impact. That's the only way you caught the ball.
Yeah.
But that's not. The ball hit right to you is the hardest one to judge, and he took one step in and slipped.
Right.
That ball was over his head by a mile. There's no way he's going to catch that ball. And I was it just amazed me that all the sports writers in St. Louis, nobody ever mentioned the fact that that ball was not catchable. All they harped on was how Flood said, I couldn't caught the ball, I blew it, and yada yada yada, blah blah. That's nonsense. He couldn't have caught that ball in a million years.
Well, what's funny about that, Larry, is that you think that with as good as Kurt Flood was in center field, and he was outstanding.
He was great.
That you think that would have caused the writers to say, well, gee, if Kurt Flood couldn't catch it, then I guess nobody could. But instead, it almost was like they used Kurt Flood's skill against him by saying because he was Kurt Flood, he should have caught that.
Immediately after the game, Flood himself came out and said, "I'm sorry, it was my fault," and blah 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 blah. Yeah. But no one said, well, "Wait a minute now, let's look at that play. Yeah. How could he have caught that ball? There's no way he catches that ball." But
so it's a two-run
Flood
triple.
Immediately.
It's a two-run triple, and then they scored. And they score Northrop later, so they score 3 runs in the 7th. And by this time, Mayo's not even asking Lolich how he feels. He's just going to assume he's going to finish the game. Tigers had a run in the 9th, and then the only run the Cardinals scored was a home run by I think Mike Shannon. In the bottom of the 9th.
Mike Shannon.
And it would spoil the shutout, but didn't come close to doing anything as far as the game goes. And there you have it. Game 7 victory on the road.
Going back before the 7th inning, the Cardinals had, in the bottom of the 6th, Brock leads off with a single. It gets picked off, trying to steal.
That's right.
1 out later, Flood gets the single. He gets picked off the same exact way. I guess they thought they could just randomly score. Well, so that kind of took the wind out of their sails. They got two hits, nothing to show for it, and then that's when all hell broke loose in the 7th inning.
Good point on that one.
With 2 outs.
Good job by Larry on that, because Lolich had a great pickoff move. Brock and Flood were not alone, by the way. Lolich got a lot of guys that way. Lolich had a great move to first base, and it was almost
like they're taunting him to try and pick him off. Right. They didn't care. They said, "Well, I'm just going to go and steal second anyway. You take me off." Of course, they're out by a mile.
Well, those leads that Brock got off first base were just heinous. I mean, he was halfway to second base on some of those leads. Which is ridiculous.
He already had stolen base number 8 figured out in his mind.
Right.
And Flood thought he could do the same thing, but no, it didn't work out. But that kind of took the wind out of their sails a little bit too.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's one of those things that you kind of gets lost in the shuffle because everybody talks about the Flood in the Northrop hit and the whole 9 yards.
That was the big play. Yeah, the Northrop hit.
You're right. It's those plays beforehand. A lot of times these big plays that we talk about in big games often don't happen 7th inning on. A lot of times they happen earlier in the game and they kind of get lost in the shuffle because had those plays gone a different way, maybe the game would have gone a different way. So that's a good job by you to point that out. So there it is. Game 7, Tigers win it 4-1, and then cap the comeback. And let's talk, Larry, about the Cardinals after that. Between 68 and 82, their next World Series appearance. Much like the Tigers, although the Tigers did win a division in 72, but the Cardinals kind of lost their way. They weren't very competitive in the 70s, for example. Kind of talk about that era of Cardinals baseball that wasn't very good.
Well, 69, going into the 69 season, they were still favored to win the National League by a wide margin. In fact, they just acquired Veda Pinson from the Reds. They traded young Bobby Tolan over to Cincinnati, who would later go on to be a star for them.
Right.
So it was a series of bad moves, bad trades the Cardinals made in the late 60s, early 70s, which basically led to their demise for the entire decade of the 70s. Of course, the Steve Carlton trade was horrendous. They traded him, and after a good 71 season, I guess he asked for a $10,000 a year raise, and Gussie Busch, the owner, said, "Nah, we'll trade the son of a bitch. We don't want him around." So they traded him. They got Rick Wise, who was a good pitcher, but not a great pitcher.
Right.
And of course, Carlton went on to win 27 games for the Phillies in '72. It was one of the greatest seasons ever by a pitcher. I think he won over 40% of the total wins was attributed to Carlton.
Right.
But and then the Cardinals also got rid of Jerry Royce, another good left-handed pitcher. They made a lot of bad moves in the '70s, which spelled disaster for them. They had no chance of ever winning a division in the '70s. So it's kind of a bleak time for Cardinal fans.
Al, talk about the Tigers, the direction they went in that same time frame.
Well, essentially, they kept that whole group together till post 1972. Obviously, they made a change at manager, ultimately going with Billy Martin, who got one last gasp out of that team in '72, winning the East. Actually, and they won the East on a fluke because the Tigers ended up playing. I think they won by half a game, I believe, because they played one less game.
One more game.
Yeah, one more game. I think then the second place team was of the labor unrest, if I remember right, the strike.
Yes, that's correct.
So, but again, they lost it, I believe, 5 games to the Oakland A's. That was the beginning of their dynasty, while the Tigers, essentially, that was the last gas of relevance till the 80s, essentially. Right. The problem with the Tigers is, a couple things. Obviously, Denny McClain, his arm fell off. He ultimately got traded to Washington. And actually, that was a great trade because the Tigers got the complete left side of the infield, Aurelio Rodriguez, Ed Brinkman, along with getting Joe Coleman, who was a very good starter.
Yep.
But essentially, at that point, the Tigers were just patching things together with that core group, trying to get one more World Series run out of them. They never could do it. Essentially, they ran out of gas after '72. Billy Martin got fired, I believe, in '73.
Yep.
The team fell apart, hit rock bottom in '75. And there were still some of the '68 team left there. I think like Mickey Stanley was still on that team. Willie Horton was still on that team.
Freehand, Lulich.
Freehand.
And that team is most known for, the '75 team, for losing 19 straight games.
Yep.
In, I believe, August, in the dog days. And that team ended up losing 103, 105 games. And essentially, the core of that team finally ran out of gas in the mid-'70s, and that's when the core of the '84 team started to strike a lin around '76, '77, '78. And that's when the Tigers began to find relevancy again, when the Trammels, Whitakers, Gibsons, Parishes, Morrises all started to arrive in the late '70s. But yeah, those from about '73 to '77 or so, the Tigers were a lost franchise.
Yep.
And they had their essentially babysitting manager in Ralph Houck, who essentially has Ron Gardenhire today essentially has the same job to ride herd over a rebuild. And the rebuild was successful, but it took almost 2 decades when it comes down to it.
Larry, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. We could go on and on and on. We could talk about the next. We could take it to the next generation.
We should do it again. 2006.
Yeah, we should.
My pleasure, guys. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun, and thanks for doing this. And I'm glad that we were able to do this with somebody who knows so much about the Cardinals as you do. And I hope it was as enjoyable for you as it was for us.
It certainly was, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Larry. Have a good evening, and we'll talk to you soon, buddy.
Okay, guys. Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Larry Underwood, author. Follow him on Twitter at LAU56 if you would. Good guy. Knows tons about the Cardinals, obviously, but also knows a lot about baseball in general. He's a big baseball fan, and knows a lot about the game as opposed to just about the Cardinals. But that was a lot of fun, Al. I'm glad we did that.
Yeah, well, we should do it again with the 2016 because that was really an unexpected year for the Tigers.
Right.
No one saw that coming, and obviously the Cardinals have managed to somehow stay relevant for almost from the early '80s on.
Right.
and one thing I would like to ask him also was about the best fans in baseball shtick as well, which kind of rubs me the wrong way if you ask me, but that's a discussion for another time.
Okay, well, we're probably not going to get to very much other stuff tonight, but that's okay. What do you want to do next?
We'll do our best. So with that, let's get to the birthday game and get rolling.
Oh, yeah, that's right. My goodness. Clue 2, this is for Rock'em Sock'em Robots. Born on this date in 1966, made his living on the mound, made his living for pretty much one team. I don't think he played for anybody. He did play for the Mets, but he made his main contribution with another NL East team, and he is a Hall of Famer. And he was a first ballot Hall of Famer, no less, and he was a left-hander.
Left-hander, Hall of Fame, played below the Mason-Dixon line, was essentially known for one team, but obviously you said he played for two.
Played for the Mets, but that's not the team he was known for, but he did play for the Mets.
And a left-hander. I think Steve Carlton comes to mind, but he played for three teams. Cardinals, Phillies. And,
this is way before. This is way after.
Yeah, exactly.
He was born in 66, so.
Yeah. 66 would put this in the 80s.
80s and 90s.
80s into the 90s. Shoot. God dang it. I'm not going to sit here and hem and haw because we got a lot to talk about. So give me the gimme in 15 minutes and we'll go from there.
Okay.
All right. So, and I'll probably kick myself when you finally get
Yes, you will.
But yeah,
yes,
I'm
you
sure
will.
I will. All right. Well, got a lot to talk about because there were more Stan Van Gundy hot seat rumors with the Pistons. Actually, there are some hot seat rumors around Ken Holland and as GM of the Red Wings as well. Opening day is this week with the Tigers. Jordan Zimmerman, of all people, is going to get the start. And obviously, the big story around here for the past 3 weeks has been the University of Michigan making a run to the Final Four. We should touch on this first because obviously this is an ongoing story with the Michigan and MSU for that matter. And the fact that, Greg, I don't remember, I think there's only been, at least on the side of the bracket that the Michigan's been on, I don't think I ever remember seeing a non-chalk bracket as it's gone on in the on the Michigan side of the bracket, because Michigan has won in all kinds of different ways. They've won in, as you call, rock fights. They've won, like the first game against they beat Montana. That was an absolute slog. Houston was essentially a defensive battle. Then they blew out Texas A&M. I haven't seen Michigan play that well all year offensively. And then they won in the Elite Eight by winning another defensive battle against a more athletic, longer, and taller Florida State, but they were able to pull it out. So, but it comes down to, you get seeded, you earn your seed, and then however things fall from there, you can only play with your schedule. But it's interesting that Michigan, to get to the Final Four, Montana was a 14, Houston was a 6, Texas A&M was a 7, and FSU was a 9. By the time the second weekend of the tournament came around, Greg, the only high seed left in the bracket was Michigan. All the other 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s were gone except for Michigan, which is absolutely insane. But you can't hold it against the team. You can only play who you play, and that is part of the charm of the tournament, Greg, is that people love the upsets. Then they get pissed off that they end up with a couple Cinderellas deep into the tournament, as we're seeing with Michigan's going to play in the semifinal. They're going to play Loyola Chicago, and the 98-year-old nun who is their chaplain. What's her name? Sister Jean, who I think is going to get more press than anybody on all four teams in the tournament for the next week or so. But if there was a year that it's set up for Michigan to win its second national title in basketball, this is it. I mean, they're going to be favored against Loyola, and then it's a matter of taking care of business in the championship game. It's going to be either two number one seeds made on the other side of the bracket. It'll be Villanova and Kansas that are going to play on the other side. But if John Beilein is going to win his national title, because I think you could make an argument that Beilein is probably the best coach in basketball to have not won a national title at this point. This is his second Final Four now, his second in 6 years with Michigan. This is the year to do it. I mean, the brackets fell their way. And he has a team that actually plays defense, which is I've never seen John Beilein's teams. We're always known for their offense, but this one, there's a couple games in this tournament that previous Beilein teams would have lost because they could not stop other teams. When their three-point shots weren't falling, that was it for Michigan. Not this year, because when the three-point shots didn't fall, for example, against FSU, they shot 19% from three, but they still won because they have such shut-down defense, and he can go 10 deep, and all of them have bought into the defensive mindset. All of a sudden, John Beilein's got a team that can beat anybody in the country because even when they don't score, Greg, they can stop the other team. And it's watching that defense just swarm over Texas A&M and FSU. They can beat anybody in the country right now. And the fact that they've won 13 in a row.
Well, 2 weeks ago, I wrote a column and I told you that in the column I said that Michigan was going to. I thought that this was Michigan's year.
Yeah.
We talked about the defense. We talked about how you can hang your hat on that in a tournament run, and you can kind of neutralize some of these offenses that are come into the tournament scoring 80 points a game. And
for example, FSU was averaging 80 points a game in the regular season. They scored, I think, 53 Saturday night.
And it can save your bacon when you yourself are offensively challenged. You can be kept in games by your defense. And Michigan has won games in various ways, of course, in this tournament, which is another thing you have to do if you're going to win the whole thing. And they gutted out a 58-54 win. That's what you have to do, but that's what you can do if you've got the defense that John Beilein has. And you mentioned it a couple of minutes ago when you said that, hey, there may not be a better time to win the championship than this. Now, of course, there are two number one seeds in the other bracket, but you're right. This is a lot of things have already fallen their way in their region and their side of the bracket. And no disrespect to Loyola, because how can you disrespect any team that made the Final Four? But as an 11th seed, sooner or later, Cinderella usually. Midnight usually. We've seen it happen, of course. Villanova in '85 and North Carolina State in '82.
But we're talking. This is probably like most of the teams at this level get knocked out by the Final Four. I think two other 11 seeds have done it. VCU.
Yeah,
they got knocked out in the Final Four, and there's one other team, but they've never made it past. 11 seed has never made it past where they're at right now.
Right.
And going into this game, Michigan is going to be favored. I think Ken Pom says they're going to be a 6 or 7 point favorite, which is actually pretty good size in the tournament. So this is going to be, like I said, I think we're both in agreement there. If Beilein's going to win his national title, and at 65 years old, the clock's ticking.
Right.
And realistically, he didn't end up. He reached a school that's capable of winning one late in his career because he's been at Michigan about a little over 10 years now. Right. So he was well into his 50s by the time he got the Michigan job. Like someone like Tom Izzo, he's been at Michigan State since forever essentially. And I guess that leads us to Tom. We got to talk about Tom Izzo as well because the other hot topic around here was not just Michigan and John Beilein making their run. It was essentially Beilein is now become known as Mr. March compared to Tom Izzo, who isn't anymore, because Izzo made his reputation on having March runs no matter where his team was seated. And now, Beilein, has won 2 consecutive Big Ten tournaments. He's made a second deep run for a second year in a row into the NCAA, and now this is the 3rd straight year in a row where Izzo's Michigan State has been knocked out in the first weekend. Going back 2 years ago where they had one of the biggest upsets in tournament history when they lost to Middle Tennessee State as a 2 seed, a 2-15 game. Didn't get out of the first week. I think they made it to the round of 32 last year. And this was supposed to be Izzo's most talented team ever. With Jackson, Miles Bridges, Nick Ward, a team full of lottery picks. Yet they struggled to beat Bucknell at home. That was the other controversy, is that they got the Detroit regional, sub-regional, while Michigan got sent to Wichita and then Los Angeles. Michigan State got home games at Little Caesars Arena, but they struggled to beat Bucknell, beat them by 4 to 15 seed, and then they were upset by 11 seed Syracuse with some of the strangest strategy I've ever seen by essentially Tom Izzo trying to beat that 2-3 zone of Jim Boeheim, playing essentially one of his walk-ons in the middle of the zone on offense. I believe he was a 6-year graduate transfer who played less than, I think, 10 minutes total in the Big Ten tournament, yet he played 25 in that game. I think he put up 2 points and maybe 1 assist, while Jalen Jackson, sat on the bench and played like 12 minutes in that game. And this is a guy who was a consensus top 5 lottery pick if he leaves after this year. So that started, Greg, as the game passed Tom Izzo by, and seeing how he handled this team, even though they won over 30 games, they never really looked like a team that was capable of really making that deep run, despite the national media making one of their top picks to make a deep run. But if you watch them play here, especially when you see in Michigan having beaten them twice, and they never really beat a good team all year because it was a down year in the Big Ten. In any tournament, they beat only 3 tournament teams all year. One of them was Bucknell in the tournament. Obviously, the cries have become, Michigan's now the basketball school, and games past Tom Izzo by and all that. I'm not willing to go there yet, but I have a feeling Tom Izzo's got to do a little soul searching, Greg, and maybe start like Beilein. He's adapted. Specifically when it comes to defense, he has changed his coaching. Izzo has not yet done that, and you got to wonder if his style of coaching is not tailored to the one and dones and the short timers that he's been recruiting.
Right.
Because I think that's the question, because Miles Bridges I don't think Miles Bridges ever got better under Tom Izzo. Jackson, I don't think, was ever used correctly under Tom Izzo. And I think that's becoming a problem with Izzo, is that the type of players he's recruiting, I don't think work well under his style of coaching. Because I think Izzo, he still coaches like it's 2000, and he has a bunch of 4-year guys on his team going back to the Flintstones era, where he's got guys on his team that he can yell and scream at, but they've been there for 4 years and they know that it's tough love. And it's a lot different when you're doing it against a guy who's going to bolt after the season. So I'm beginning to wonder, if Tom Izzo may have to maybe either change how he recruits or change how he's coaching. And I have a feeling it'd probably end up being change how he recruits, because the one-and-dones aren't doing what they're supposed to do at Michigan State.
It's funny because they still won over 30 games.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing. But if you watch Michigan State, though, they just never looked like they weren't down. They never put together a stretch like Michigan is on right now.
Right.
That's the thing. They won all these games, but it was against not very good. Yeah. Anytime they played against tournament quality opponents, they didn't play well. Well, they didn't play very many of those guys.
You talked about Beilein making his second Final Four appearance in 6 years. If you look at the last 6 years, if you want to compare apples to apples, the last 6 years of Michigan State's tournament finishes haven't been very good.
Yeah.
And I think this is the second or third time his team has been eliminated in the first or second round. I'm talking about Izzo now, in recent years. And
3 straight years now.
Yeah, and so that's...
For a guy who made his reputation as a tournament coach.
I guess what it does, Al, is it just... Right. What it does is it just kind of, I guess, illuminates, even though Duke lost today to Kansas, it just illuminates how good guys like Krzyzewski are. Guys who've been around as long, if not longer, than Izzo, and have been working under the same rules essentially as Izzo in terms of, we're seeing this whole one and done phenomenon, which I don't particularly care for, but Krzyzewski is able to obviously, and Calipari are able to do it, are able to. I'm not saying that Tom's not doing it, but I mean, obviously, there's something that's not clicking. We can, you can, if you wanted to be an Izzo or even a Michigan State basketball apologist, you could kind of say, well, let's toss this year out the window because of all the Larry Nassar goings on and the
ESPN story,
the distractions and so forth. And okay, I'll buy that. Is it a crutch? Maybe, but that's a legitimate That's a legitimate concern. I'll buy that.
And I don't think he handled a lot of that very well either.
He did not handle it very well. As a matter of fact, his exit interview after the loss to Syracuse was kind of, I think, trying to almost like he was trying to put himself up as a martyr, which I didn't like.
That's the other thing with Izzo is I don't care for him, and D'Antonio tend to do that. That kind of bugs me.
Yeah, and as far as the screaming and yelling goes, Al, the players that go to Michigan State who agree to go to who commit to Michigan State, they know this going in.
Yeah, it's the Bobby Knight thing. People still want to play for Bobby.
Yeah, it's not something that they show up at the first practice and they're surprised that Coach Izzo is like that. So, but what could be, but of course it's one thing to think you know what it's all about, and then to actually play for him and realize what you're into.
Right.
But you mentioned, I think one thing I want to come back to what you said, which I think is interesting, is you said Bridges not developing. Kind of expand.
If anything, he cost himself a few $1 million if he, from not going. He was probably a top 5 lottery guy last year. He's probably maybe a lottery guy, but he won't go top 5 this year. I don't think he improved much at all.
Why do you suppose that is?
I think that Izzo, I don't think it was one, played him out of position, and two, I just don't. I've said it. You've heard me say this numerous times when it comes to talking about coaches and managers. You need to put your players in the best position to be successful. If that means running your offense differently, or playing a different type of defense, so on and so forth. I think in some ways, with a guy like Miles Bridges, who I think. His type of play really wasn't designed for Tom Izzo's type of offense, so it's kind of trying to put a round peg into a square hole, so to speak. Or, especially in today's game, Bridges is more of a slasher. I think he needs to have more of a freewheeling style. And while then you have Tom Izzo offense, which is essentially slow it down, run your set, that kind of thing. More of a plotting type offense. And I just don't think he fit into that very well. And if he had gone last year, he probably would have been a top 5 pick. He's cost himself several $1 million by not going pro, which is why Jackson, I think he's got to go, or he's going to be costing himself some money. But I just think that he just wasn't a good fit for Izzo's system, because I think Izzo was recruiting talent rather than like John Beilein, who recruits talent that fits in how he wants to run his offense and defense. And I think that's the difference. Izzo has changed to who he's gone after. He's going after the same guys that Calipari goes after, that Coach K goes after, Bill Self goes after, the guys who aren't going to be their entire career. And I think that gives that, when you get that kind of talent, sometimes you just can't coach them up. Sometimes you have to say, here's the ball, use your talent, score points. And I don't think Tom Izzo would ever allow that. Because as you see, when you see teams like Kentucky play or Kansas play, they're a lot more wide open, a little more freewheeling, because their coaches know some of these guys aren't going to be here next year, so I can't be laying groundwork down for 2 years down the line. I have to be playing to win right now because this guy's not going to be here next year. And I think that's the problem with the type of talent Izzo's bringing in. Izzo's coaching he's coaching like he still thinks he has Mateen Cleaves. He's got Miles Bridges. They're two completely different things.
Well, since I think we can both agree that Michigan State's never going to fire Tom Izzo. So
no,
what is the if you're a Michigan State basketball fan, what's going through your mind right now? If you know that they're not going to get rid of Izzo, and you're seeing these missed opportunities go by the wayside, I
think you have to be. It kind of reminds me maybe of Lloyd Carr's final years at Michigan. You're going to have some decent years, but you're also going to think, God, there's a lot of missed opportunities here. If he would have changed things a little bit, because it kind of reminds me. Remember Lloyd Carr's last game, where it was they played Florida in the bowl game.
Yeah, right.
And he opened up the floodgates and let his offense just go.
Right.
And they ran Florida right off the field, and people were like, "Where's that been all season? Why did this team lose 5 games?" Because if they could play like this, they wouldn't have lost 4 or 5 games. And I think that's what Izzo was heading if he doesn't at least change his thought process or change how he recruits, in that they're going to be good, but they're not going to be great. And Izzo has set a baseline of great. And if I'm a Michigan State fan, I got to be wondering if we're ever going to see that. Because there was that period, you go from probably about 2000 to 2015, where Michigan State was the elite of the elite. They were up there with Duke and Kansas and Kentucky. And I think we're starting to see they're going down to that next level where they're going to be good, and they're still getting high seeds because of that reputation. Because he's Tom Izzo and he's Mr. March, and and I don't think, unless things change, and I'm not sure they're going to, that they're not going to live up to that high seeding. And right now, it's beginning to look right now, Michigan is becoming the dominant basketball program in the state. But it can change in a heartbeat. Izzo can find the right guys. Who knows who's going to leave Michigan? There's a lot of talk that Mo Wagner might go pro. Jackson may stay, and he is a world-class basketball player, because things can change. But at least as of right now, it looks like Beilein's got he's headed up with the Blue Bloods right now. If Michigan's not a top 10 program, they're easily top 20, top 15 now, and for years they weren't. And it looks like Izzo is going from that top 5 program to that top 20 program. Still good, but they're not going to be the national title contender every year like they were for about a decade. So I don't know how you can change that, other than I think Tom Izzo's got to have look himself in the mirror and decide what he wants to do. And if I were him, I'd start going towards the Beilein model. Going, I need guys who I can coach the way I want to coach, and one and dones aren't those kind of guys.
Yeah, it's a different world now. There's no question about it. But again, these you mentioned Self, Coach K, Calipari. There's still these icons who are they're adapting and
there's a lot of really, really good coaches out there right now. And a lot of blue blood schools.
Right. Are you ready to go to another clue?
Yeah,
with the gimme clue?
Give me the gimme, and I'll kick myself in the rear.
Well, this pitcher pitched for the Braves. That was his team. He's not Greg Maddux, so I'll tell you that. Because he's a lefty. He's not John Smoltz, because he's the lefty. Yeah. So it's the lefty in that trio.
Oh shoot! It was Smoltz. It was Smoltz, Maddux. It was Smoltz, Maddux, Glavine.
Right there, you just said it.
Yeah.
Glavine, Tommy Glavine.
I had to run through the rotation real quick.
Yeah, Tommy Glavine, 52 years old today. He pitched 5 years with the Mets, and he wasn't bad with the Mets, but he obviously. I
completely forgot that. I always thought of him as a Brave.
I think he's the last. Right. Well, you should. I think he was the last 300-game winner that we've seen. Yeah. He won 305 games. I don't think anybody won 300 since he retired.
Right.
I don't think so. His last game was 10 years ago, but yeah, Glavine was 90.
That's something. He on that rotation, he's still number 3 behind Maddux and Smoltz. That's crazy.
Right. It is crazy. It is crazy, but Tom Glavine, 52 years old today, so happy birthday to him.
I'm going to kick myself, and I guess I'll have to wait for something else to put on that spot where I was going to put the robot boxing. What the hell is that game again?
Rock'em Sock'em
Robots. God damn it, I'm getting old. All right, let's get this hot seat stuff out of the way before we wrap up the podcast, Greg.
Sure.
All right. The latest Stan Van Gundy hot seat rumor came this week from the New York Times. Was it Mark Stein, their basketball writer? So this is not coming from a fly-by-night outfit, in other words.
Right.
What his sources are telling him is that the Pistons have quote-unquote expressed interest in Chauncey Billups, who's currently an analyst at ESPN, a talking head, who has no management experience at all since he's retired, working in tandem with Tellum, who currently is in the Pistons front office, but he runs business operations, not basketball operations.
Right.
So the rumor is that Tom Gores would want SVG to finish out his last year as coach, and then place him in the front office with a combination of Tellum and Chauncey Billups, because a lot of this has to do with SVG has one more year left on his contract, but almost everybody on his staff, their contract ends after this year. So there could be a big front office shakeup. Pistons PR, Greg, released a one-word response. False is all they said. Chauncey Billups issued the standard respectful denial saying, I'm very happy where I'm at. I'm not actively looking for a job, blah, blah, blah. But obviously there's something out there because he was rumored to be take over as the GM of the Cavaliers last offseason, which didn't work out. I believe he turned it down. And this is all coming to a head, Greg, because the Pistons are still mathematically alive for a playoff spot, but they're pretty much eliminated from contention. And the issue is they're in salary cap hell for at least the next 2 seasons, thanks to SVG's personnel moves. So major change kind of seems inevitable at this point. I know when we last talked, I was on the let's give SVG one more year. But with this rumor coming out, and it does not surprise me that Tellum wants to make a little power play to take over the Pistons front office. And obviously Chauncey Billups' hire would be a home run with the fan base just because he's Mr. Big Shot, Chauncey Billups. And the fact that you figure in almost the entire front office is on the end of their contracts, I can't see SVG staying if that means he's got to give up all his power. He's gone. But it's come from the New York Times. Mark Stein, that's a legit. He's got sources, in other words.
Right.
Do you think there's thought to this? Because this is the second year in a row this Billups stuff has started, but he wants to get into a front office job. My issue with that is neither one of these guys, Tellum or Billups, has basketball operations experience. It'd be I'm getting Matt Millen vibes all over this. To be honest with you.
Well. Yeah, I know. I hear what you're saying about that. Billups came out to his credit and shot down the rumors, said that he feels bad that these even came to light because, A, according to him, it's not true, and B, it puts Stan in a weird position and puts Chauncey in a weird position. And he says, as much as I love the Pistons, everybody knows how I feel about the Pistons. Yeah. I'm not going to comment on. I'm not going to. Those jobs aren't open right now. Yeah. What we do have to say, though, unlike Millen, who was plucked from the booth with absolutely no other team wanted him other than the Lions, Billups was up for the Cavaliers GM job last year and lost out. So there are other NBA teams, at least one other anyway.
Yeah, and he also has factor in Dan Gilbert, and he's got Detroit ties as well.
Well,
so
it's true.
There's some caveats there.
That's true. That. No, that's true. That's a good point. But, the Matt Millen thing, first of all, I think it's just two totally different things. I mean, building a football team where you got a 53-man roster, and you've got a culture there that was already bad when he got there in defense of him, versus the basketball. You got essentially, if you can get 2 really good players, you can make some noise in the NBA. And now, whether you still probably can't win a championship unless you've got 2 superstars. But if you've got 2 really good players, you can build around and so forth. You mentioned the fans, of course. It's always about what the act that you're following. When Matt Millen was hired in 2001, I was one of the folks who thought, what the hell? Why not? I mean,
I'm with you there. It's like we need some sort of change.
Lions weren't. Let's face it. Let's look. I mean, they had been making the playoffs, but they weren't doing anything in the playoffs. So they felt like, okay, what? Why not?
Let's blow it up. Yeah.
Right, and that's a whole other story, of course. But here, the same thing would be the same phenomenon. Nobody's gonna. This act that if Stan is let go or whatever his time here is done, whoever comes in is not going to have a tough act to follow, and whoever comes in, the fans are going to be welcoming that person with open arms, whether it's Chauncey Billups or whomever else. What I'd rather see the Pistons do, as much as I love Chauncey Billups, what I'd rather see the Pistons do is I'd rather see them try to poach another executive. And I would have to look to see who's available.
There's a lot of names out there, but I know exactly what you're saying about.
Yeah, I would love for them to hire, poach another guy from another team who's either A, been a general manager in the NBA, or B, is one of those guys that is considered a GM a GM in the making, who's ready, who's honed his skills, he's worked in the front office as maybe an assistant.
Bob Quinn.
Right, exactly. And that's what I'd rather see them do, frankly. No disrespect to Chauncey, I love him, but there is that fear factor. Now, you can look back and say, well, geez, Danny Ainge, who to me is one of the best GMs in the business, he didn't have any front office experience. I mean, you always have to start somewhere. I get it.
Right.
And I guess if you're going to start somewhere, you may as well start with a bad team and see
a team that really can't do anything for 2 years.
Right. Which is both fair and unfair. So yeah. I don't know. I'm not gonna. I wouldn't cry if they went the Chauncey Billups route because I know there'd be some juice with that. But
yeah.
From a basketball standpoint, I would, if they're going to make a move with Stan, I would prefer that they really, and this is what scares me about Gores. I'm not, is really do their homework and try to get a guy who might be either has worn his welcome out somewhere else or might be up on the verge of a contract situation and it could possibly be lured to Detroit. Somebody who's got experience in the front office, right. Somebody who's done it before. That's what I would prefer that they do. It hasn't worked out. I mean, Dumars, they got lucky with Joe Dumars, who had zero front office experience when they hired him.
But that the difference was, though, he did run his own company and things like that. He was a businessman. So
let's face it,
not basketball, but he did run companies.
That was a coming together of a lot of different perfect storm, and he got it. He got the right coach in there, Rick Carlisle. For a couple of years, and then he hired Larry Brown. I mean, you can't. The first 5 or 6 years, or 7 or 8 years, even of Joe's time here was not bad. So, but that was, yes, it can be done. Okay. Now Dumars was practically off the floor. He took his jersey off and became a GM. Yeah. Billups has been, away from playing for a few years. He's been watching the league as a broadcaster. I'm sure he's still got a lot of ties to the NBA. I know he's very well respected in the NBA, but as a player, so we'll see if that does sound like something that the Pistons would do.
It sounds like something Tom Gores would do. That's what I'm saying.
Right, yeah. And just as nobody has gone the two-headed monster route with the Pistons do with Van Gundy since Stan was hired.
Right.
I don't know. I can't recall any. Unless help me out here. I don't recall any teams snatching a guy out of the broadcast booth or just hanging up his sneakers to be a GM in this league either.
No. More. It seems more happening more in the NFL, like John Lynch. With San Francisco right now. But yeah, you're right. But it just seems like a Tom Gores thing to do because if anything, he seems to be all about the damn optics. Even from the getting the Art Van sponsorship to cover up the damn seats at LCA, so the red doesn't show as much, so they put black seat covers on. It's all about optics with him, and this would be another one of those. And my fear is that it might put the Pistons back on that coaching carousel thing again, which we saw for a decade. With this, going from coach to coach every year or two, and we'll see what happens. But this is one of those, Greg, where I think it's where there's smoke, there's fire. And it really has come that, Gore, it seems like Gores is just focused on make the damn playoffs. You don't make the damn playoffs, you're out the door. That's what it's beginning to look like. But all right, we got to talk about the other hot seat, or maybe not so hot seat, it turns out to be, and that would be Red Wings GM Ken Holland, Greg. I think we both assumed he was a dead GM walking. Over the past few months, but maybe not so quick, not so fast, as they say, because this, obviously the Red Wings were eliminated from playoff contention this week. There's still 8 games left to play. They got knocked out, I think, a game or two ago. But also, though, during this same week, Craig Custance of The Athletic, which is getting a lot of scoops lately, they're getting a lot of good writers there. I may have to break down and actually get a subscription. But he's reporting unnamed sources once again. But he's another guy who has legit sources, and he is tight with the Red Wings organization. They are claiming that Holland is, if he doesn't get a contract, it would be shocking. And it's being thrown out there that a 3-year extension may be on the table for Ken Holland. Custis says that momentum is growing in the NHL, that they believe Holland will get the chance to see the rebuild through. So if they're going to make a decision, Greg, there's only 8 games left in the year. His contract's up at the end of the season. You would think that if he's going to get this extension, you'd think they would make a move pretty darn soon, because they're going to have to, the off season is going to be upon us soon. They're going to have to start planning for next year. The decision has to be made on Jeff Blashill. The decision needs to be made on Ken Holland. Obviously, they're going to have a very high draft pick. It may end up being the number 1 draft pick for all we know, depending on how they fall in the lottery. The only question is, I don't think this would make a very happy fan base. I think this is a fan base that has been itching for change for several years now. And keeping Holland, even though I have to admit he has made some solid moves. When they finally kind of said maybe we should rebuild, with all the draft picks he's starting to gather. He's made some fairly decent trades. Obviously, the draft picks of the last couple of years, that remains to be seen. We don't know how that's going to turn out yet. But he is, I guess the question is, we just don't know how he could handle a rebuild because he's never done one before. And I think that has the fan base really scared because they've seen too many of these contracts given to older players for too long a term, for too much money, with non-trade clauses in them. And they're terrified of what he may end up doing once he thinks, I have a team that could slip into an 8 seed. And then we're back on that same treadmill again. Yeah. I think that's my fear, is that once they think we're close enough to the playoffs, they may start going on this damn treadmill again instead of doing the right thing, breaking it down to the studs and rebuilding up. So that's my fear. I don't know if Holland is into that, but according to Craig Custance, Greg, that's maybe what's going to happen.
Well, Ken's been here for 21 years as a GM. He's been here for 21 years, and you talked when we were talking about the Tom Izzo situation. You said, "Well, gosh, Tom seems like he's coaching like it's still 2000, and he's got Mateen Cleaves and the Flintstones and so forth." And sometimes Ken has functioned as GM as if it's still 2005, and he can, and he's handing out these contracts, like you said, to the Luke Glendennings of the world and getting guys like Franz Nielsen. And,
that Franz Nielsen deal
went out and got Daniel Alfredson in 1 year and, traded for David Legwand. And
I'm going to scream.
So, I mean, if there's ever a time for change at the top, it's now. Yeah. I'm glad that the Red Wings missed the playoffs for the second consecutive year, because I was afraid that if they missed once and then snuck in after missing once, it would be like, well, okay, we had this long streak and we missed the playoffs. Now we're back. Now we're back in the playoffs. And now that they've missed 2 years in a row, you would think that would kind of say, okay, it's okay now. It's okay to miss the playoffs. Yeah. It's okay. Look at what we were talking about, guys who don't have any front office experience when we're talking about the NBA. But look at what Brendan Shanahan has done in Toronto. Look at what Steve Yzerman has done in Tampa. Yeah. They've turned those franchises around, and now you can say, they got Austin Matthews in Toronto. Of course, they turned it around. Well, it's not just Austin Matthews. They've done a lot of really good things over there. Shanahan brought in Lou Lamoriello, who to me is a Hall of Fame executive, and he hired Mike Babcock, who's a Hall of Fame coach, as far as I'm concerned, as coach. Mm-hmm. So, and they got Austin Matthews, yes. Yeah. So, but it's not. So they've been able to create on that and talk about a culture that has been, down in the dumps in Toronto. My gosh, they haven't won a Stanley Cup in 51 years, and that fan base was ready to tear its hair out. Well, now the Maple Leafs are to me legitimate Stanley Cup contenders now. I mean, they got 97. They're going to get over 100 points. Babcock is doing his Babcock thing. Yep. He's winning and pissing people off, but that's okay. And Shanahan and Lou Lamoriello are doing their thing. So I just think that it's time to make to change. This is no better time to make a change, Al, with the Red Wings than right now. You've missed the playoffs 2 years in a row. You've got some components to work with. You've got the Larkins of the world and the Athanasios of the world and the Manthas of the world, and there's some young talent to build around. There really is, but and you mentioned the draft pick, but that they're gonna get. But I just think that it's time to just. This is the time now to recognize that, Ken Holland, we thank you for your service. This is a new era of Red Wing hockey now. I don't even know what's going to happen with Blashill. I don't know if he's going to be a casualty. Probably will be, but I mean, this is not about Blashill. Obviously, it's more about Holland.
Right.
And I just think that I just don't know. This is just a situation that just cries out for a change in leadership. You're right. Kenny did do a pretty good job, and a better job than I thought he would do, frankly, at the trade deadline. But to me, it's not enough. I just think it's time to there just comes a time sometimes, this, you've been following this for years. There's just comes a time where it's time.
Yeah.
And I just think that the Red Wings have reached that time. That's why I was thinking that missing the playoffs 2 years in a row would kind of, say we're off into a new era now. Yeah. This wasn't just a fluke that we missed the playoffs in 2017. We've missed them again, and we've missed them even earlier than we did last year. I think last year they missed it late. Here, they missed it even earlier.
Yeah.
And so now you're missing the playoffs earlier in the year. That's telling me that it's not going in the right direction. I just don't know why you wouldn't make a move.
Yeah. Yeah, one other thing I want to throw out there to Red Wings fans. Steve Yzerman is not coming back. He's built a damn Stanley Cup contender in Tampa. He has no reason to come here and do a rebuild.
Right.
It's just sometimes things just aren't meant to be, and that is one of them.
Well, it's all about timing. It's all about time. The only reason I could see that even remotely happening, Al, is if the Lightning wins the Stanley Cup this year. Yeah. And he's got that now. He's one of the few men who've won the Cup as a player and as a GM. And maybe he says, okay, my work is done in Tampa. We won a Cup. And, of course, they made the finals already.
Right.
We won the Cup. And now maybe now I am ready. He's only 53. Yeah. Going to be 53 in May. That's not very old. He can maybe decide that he's got –
I just don't see it happening, though.
No, I'm with you. No, I agree. I don't see it happening either.
It's all about timing. The contracts never lined up.
Yeah, right.
Ken Holland didn't want to leave, and that's just how it is. Sometimes you have to move to do what you want to do.
And frankly, Al, maybe it's best this way because that this way there's no chance of Yzerman ruining his legacy as a Red Wing, because we're good, like Dumars. Do we really?
Bingo. You can have a.
Do we really remember? Do we really remember Joe Dumars as a player, or do we remember him more as a GM? I think most people remember him more as a GM, because the Pistons won a title with him as GM. Of course, they came close the second time. He was here forever. It seemed like as a general manager. There was a lot of glitzy players that came through here. A lot of high profile. There was winning. There were coaches. A lot of coaching changes. There was a lot to Joe's career here as a GM that I think his time as a player, and he was, you could make a case he was a Hall of Fame player.
Yeah,
was strictly a Hall of Fame player. It was is forgotten about now. So at least with the Yzerman thing, I know this isn't going to make a lot of people happy who want Steve here, but if he doesn't ever come here, then there's never any fear that we'll look back on his time as a Red Wing and say, oh, great player, crappy GM. But obviously he's not a crappy GM, though, because he's doing a great job with the Lightning. But just because he's doing just because he's doing a great job with the Lightning doesn't mean he'd come to Detroit and do the same thing.
Right, exactly. So, well, like I said, I'm sure by the time our next podcast rolls around, we'll know the status of Ken Holland and Jeff Blashill, because the season will be over and decisions will have to be made. All right, we had a couple more topics, but we're already pushing close to 2 hours. So I think we start needing to wrap this up. I mean, we'll have plenty of time to talk about Lions, especially the next podcast, be closer to the draft, and obviously Tiger season will be going on by then, so we'll have some Tiger stuff to talk about because we actually have about 2 weeks of baseball under our belt. So with that, who is your jerk of the week?
Well, ESPN, the magazine, came out with their 20 they did two lists, 20 most dominant players of the past 20 years and 20 most dominant teams of the past 20 years. Now, they did put in the team category, and this was all sports internationally, by the way. This wasn't just the 4 major sports in the United States. This was all over the world, soccer teams, cricket teams, the whole 9 yards. Well, anyways, a Red Wings team did make the top 10. It was a number 9, the Detroit Red Wings, but they chose the 2008 Detroit Red Wings, which to me, now I know they won the Stanley Cup, I get it. But can you tell me that 2008 team, why was that chosen instead of the 2002 team, which also won a cup, was just filled with Hall of Fame players? Brett Hull, Lidstrom, Yzerman. Of course, 08, Yzerman had been retired. Yzerman, Lidstrom, Hull, Robitaille, the Russian guys. I mean, unbelievable.
Well, there's like 11, 12 Hall of Fame players on that team.
Hasek in goal.
Yeah. And Scotty behind the bench.
Bowman, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, right. Instead of Babcock. I mean, I don't know why the decision. Unless they just looked at the one loss record and say, okay, that team is because that one loss record was slightly better than 0-2. But my goodness gracious! First of all, the 0-2 team just went right. They killed the Avalanche in Game 7. I think it was 7-0 or something. Yeah. In Game 7 of that year. You mentioned all the Hall of Famers. I mean, just that team was absolutely loaded. Yeah. Was Fedorov still on that team in 0-2? He was. Fedorov was still on that team, too.
He was still there, yeah.
My goodness. Larionov, I mean, my God. Mm-hmm. How they could pick the 08. Now, obviously, you got to give the 08 team props because they won the Cup. Right. But that team was not
they weren't
more
as good
dominant.
As no.
That team was not more dominant than the 02 team. So my jerk of the week is it burns me when magazines or somebody comes out with a list and they clearly show that they either didn't do the research or they just don't know what they're talking about. And I appreciate them putting the Red Wings in a Red Wings team in the top 10, but they put the wrong team in the top 10.
Right.
So my jerk of the week is ESPN the magazine.
Yeah, this. Well, got to remember, Greg. This is the same organization, the same website, ESPN.com. Who, they did a clickbaity article reseeding the Sweet 16. And Michigan was seeded 15th, and the bottom 4 teams when they reseeded it, the bottom 4 teams all won a Sweet 16 game. So enough said. No, that's just clickbaity stuff, and that's I think ESPN. We're going to be contrarian here and go with the oddball pick, not the obvious pick. At least that's my thought anyway. But yeah, I'm with you there. All right, I'm going to go to one of my topics we're able to get to as my jerk of the week, and I'm going to go with the Tigers and Ron Gardenhire. Because your opening day starter on the 29th, 4 days from now, is not Michael Fulmer, it's Jordan Zimmermann. And he of the 5 ERA in spring training, even though all the reports on spring training, that's always throwing the ball well, and we're going to get 200 innings out of him this year. But it just really comes off as, once again, a veteran manager, old school style manager, deferring to the veteran ball player, even though he's probably not as good, not as talented, over the up-and-coming pitcher. Fulmer is obviously the ace of the staff, yet for some reason, Gardenhire wants to set up his rotation with Zimmermann as his number 1 starter, which makes absolutely no sense. I know in the long run, doesn't really make that much difference. Right. But it's all optics. But but it just gets me, Greg, in that it gives me just another feeling that all the talk that Gardenhire said he was open to analytics and advanced metrics was just that. It was just talk. It was just so much BS. And, I'm open to it. Because it really seems to me that when push comes to shove, Gardenhire will automatically default to old school, managed by the gut style. Why else would you have Martin as your leadoff man? He of the 300 on base percentage career. That makes no sense to me, but he's fast and plays center field, so that means he's automatically a leadoff man. That's the kind of stuff I'm terrified that Gardenhire is going to do. And, in the long run, Gardenhire is probably the right guy for the job because you need a steady and veteran influence. But, come on, you've got to be open to the new era of baseball, and the new era of baseball is about getting as much information as possible, implementing that information, and not making moves in spite of what that information tells you. And this is one of those things where Fulmer's your best pitcher. You start the damn season with Fulmer on the mound. So that's my jerk of the week. The Tigers and Ron Gardenhire for essentially living down to my expectations.
Yeah, that's I hadn't really thought of it that way. I was also surprised that he named Zimmerman.
When he announced it, he actually had to convince the media he wasn't joking.
Right. That's true. That's true. And he said, look, and to him it was a no doubter. To him it was, hey, exactly. There was no as soon as I got here, as soon as I got the job, I knew he was going to be the opening day starter. And you look at Zimmerman's numbers last year. My goodness, and I know it was about a lot of it was about injury. I get it, but he did not earn.
No, he did not earn it.
But you know what? Like you said, it's a lot of it's optics. But
it's symbolic. He wants to honor the veteran, but still,
but you're scared. You're scared that it's symptomatic of things to come. Okay, well we'll see. We'll see. I want to thank Larry Underwood for obviously sharing his thoughts and recollections of the '68 World Series and the Cardinals in general. I learned some things today that I didn't know. It was pretty cool, and I'm sure he learned some things about the Tigers that he didn't know. So there was a kind of a win-win thing for both of us. And we will join you. We'll see you again here on 2 weeks from today, April the 8th. So show will be uploaded on April the 9th. As we talk, like Al said, about the first couple weeks of the baseball season, and maybe some more light will be shed on the whole Van Gundy and Kenny Holland situations with the Pistons and the Red Wings. Yep. Follow me on Twitter at Greg Eno. Follow the Knee Jerks on Twitter at the Knee Jerks, Facebook.com/the Knee Jerks, and our Knee Jerks group on Facebook. Read me at Out of Bounds on my WordPress blog and the Winged Wheeler on my WordPress blog as well. I want to thank my lovely wife Sharon, and thank you, Big Al, for making Sunday nights so gosh darn fun.
Indeed, Greg. Thank you. And actually, I want to give thanks to Larry as well. That was a fun conversation. I look forward to doing it again about, like I said, able to do about the 2006 team, so I could ask him about that damn best fan base in baseball crap. But all right, again, thank you, Greg, for taking time out of your busy weekend to talk sports with me for a few hours, and give a shout out to the listeners again. Podcast thekneejerks.net, iTunes, and Stitcher. Again, search the Knee Jerks, Eno, and Big Al. And with that, I guess we'll see you in 2 weeks. So we'll have lots more to talk about. But like Greg said, we may have a new Pistons coach manage it. We may have a new management for the Red Wings, and we'll have some baseball to talk about. God knows what the Lions will do. So until that time, this is Al Beaton saying good evening, good luck, and aloha.
Ciao, Italy, everybody. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Good night.